Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Energy Markets podcast. It is the 4th of November. It's the second day of ADIPEC, if you really want to know. And we are also looking at a Brent crude oil price that, as the commentators have mentioned off air, is little moved, not really responding to the variety of events that have happened in recent days. We had obviously the OPEC announcement on the weekend that they were going to continue to increase supply through the end of the year and then pause or suspend or stop. I'm not sure which one you want to grab as your meaningful interpretation of that, or else they just ran out of spare capacity in which to increase anymore, and they decided not to embarrass everybody by stopping. I don't know. Vandana Hari, founder and CEO of Vanda Insights, knows. Your thoughts on the supply-demand balance and why we're seeing sort of a fairly mute response from the market to OPEC Plus's decision to stop increasing supply come January?
Good morning, Sean, and my fellow panelists and all our viewers. It feels like a fragile balance for Brent around $65 a barrel. I think right now the market is sort of split between, or the forces on crude are split between the risk premium on account of the Russia sanctions and the whole, shall we call it, glut narrative, and I'm putting air quotes around glut. What OPEC did, and it was a bit of a surprise, to freeze the G8 targets for the first quarter of next year. Very sort of cryptic explanation that this was due to seasonality. Presumably, it means they want to err on the side of caution, given that Q1 is traditionally a low demand season. Look, even if they had gone forth with 137 KBD through Jan to March next year, I think the market had pretty much baked that in. And it is not the kind of 500 plus barrels, 1,000 barrels per day that they did earlier this year. So it wouldn't have tipped the needle too much, which is why I think the converse has been true, that the decision to keep it off the market has not given much of a boost to crude either.
Do you still subscribe, Vanda, just before I move on to our colleagues, to the idea that the narrative we've had through the year of the supply surplus, this sort of big wave of extra oil that the market doesn't want, that's still coming, that's what we're dealing with at the moment? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I'm certainly not sitting in the group of glut watch, Sean. I think if it is there indeed, and I am skeptical, I have my doubts about the projections of 4 to 5 million barrels per day. That would be quite a phenomenal excess supply. If it does come, I think we would see it quite clearly in the physical markets, in the structure of the futures prices, and we haven't seen it. So no matter how much either side of the glut divide wants to jawbone the market sentiment, it's just not happening. I think the market right now is simply, if it is there, if it is real, we'll see it. I think that's where we stand now.
Bill Farren-Price, Senior Research Fellow and Head of Gas Research at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Bill, your thoughts of this tug of war, obviously the supply surplus, the increase in supply that we have been witnessing from OPEC Plus over the last 9 months has sort of been a dampener on cap, a ceiling, if you like. Whether $65 Brent it was a floor for a long time, but became a ceiling through this last 6-7 months with this OPEC Plus supply increase. What's the counterforce? What's the bullish counterforce of this supply surplus that sort of keeps the price somewhat frozen around 65 on Brent?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a sort of battle of the narratives at the moment, and there's no clear sign winning, which is why I think markets, both oil and gas, are pretty flat at the moment, both in terms of the curve and the outright price. But I think that the counterbalance to the glut to the macro weakness story is really uncertainty about whether these sanctions on Russian producers will actually produce any sort of shortfall. I mean, it's all in the implementation. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that, you know, you still got a European war going on, which actually is targeting energy infrastructure, particularly oil in terms of Russia. And it'll be interesting to see whether that plays out into you know into the export markets and becomes a feature that's not just limited to the Russian domestic market. So I think there are, you know, I think it's always, when it comes to oil data.
What about on the bullish side, or that sort of counter force, the China buying for inventory stocks? That's been a kind of a supportive narrative. Does that continue, do you think?
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, China has no limit on its capacity to build new tanks. And if they feel that they want to do that, then they will continue to buy. But it doesn't necessarily reflect the underlying demand in the Chinese economy. And I think that the market's figured that out.
Sarah Vakshuri, Dr. Sarah Vakshuri, founder and president of SVB Energy International, usually sitting in the luxury of Washington, D.C., but today in the outer perimeters of the Roman Empire here in Abu Dhabi. One jest, but ultimately here at ADIPEC. Sarah, you're always a go-to person for me about the veracity and seriousness and impact of the sanctions, the U.S. sanctions. I mean, for the first time ever, I would say, is it ever, or certainly other than Iran, that Trump has kind of weighed in on this idea that the Indians and the Chinese should stop buying Russian oil. They've sanctioned the two biggest Russian oil exporters. Should we believe that this time it's serious, that Washington is going to flex its muscle on these sanctions?
Well, I would say when we say Washington, if we're talking about President Trump, definitely President Trump has a track history of implementing sanctions effectively. And again, the good example of that was Iran, that during his term, the maximum pressure was fully implemented. Now,
but this time, no, right? This time 2.0, Trump has kind of ignored his maximum pressure on Iran.
Okay.
Which has increased, yes, during Biden administration. You know, there's a lot of skepticism, but also there's also a lot of anonymous sources in the market that are talking about the fact that yes, the Indian and the Chinese refinery are going to reduce the purchases. On the other side, the contradictory news. So I would say it's very soon to judge that, but the point is that the volume of Russian export is not substitutable by anyone, even OPEC at this time. And when we don't have a substitution for that volume of export, it's very hard to think that countries would compromise their energy security and their economies. Now, maybe some of those refineries that are exporting products to US or EU, they might, let's say, swap or use another source of oil for their refineries. But it's very hard to imagine that completely the export of Russian oil to these countries, especially again China and India, would substitute. There might be some changes of flow, maybe especially in those refineries that export products to United States. But overall total is very hard to imagine because, you know, Russia total crude oil and petroleum products overall exports around 7 million barrels per day, and there's not that much of substitution for Russian oil and products.
Vandana, it would seem like the market shares Sarah's view. I mean, the idea that if we were indeed to see the Russian crude oil that is now currently the companies that are now added on this very long sanctions list, it's higher than my house. The idea that the market's not believing that this time it's serious, this time it's different, or else I would imagine we'd be seeing a much more elevated price. At the end of the day, if you knock out these oil companies in Russia, That's 3 million barrels a day. There isn't even that idle capacity left, is there? I mean, where do you bring idle capacity into this narrative, or the lack of it?
Yeah, that indeed is the tension right now in the market, Sean. So, on the one hand, skepticism that the US actually would, to Sarah's point, yes, Trump has a record of actually implementing or enforcing the sanctions. And this time around, I think he has even more at stake because he's
Yeah, but he also
been
has a record of loving Vladimir Putin. I mean, whatever sanctions he enforced on Iran 5 years ago is certainly worth noting compared to maybe now or others. But ultimately, he has been a gentle swan with Mr. Putin for decades.
That too, yes. I mean, does he really want to completely clamp down on Russian crude exports and oil exports and revenues? That's a big question mark, completely. The flip side of that argument, Sean, is that a lot of people feel that sanctions, blanket sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil is a game changer, that we can't really fall back on the precedent that has been set so far in 3.5 years of this war, that every time sanctions and new layers of sanctions were introduced, typically going after shadow fleet vessels, going after intermediaries, the more later stages, USS EU, as well as EU going after some refiners in China and India. But this, the game changer part of Rosneft and Lukoil is that now that it almost virtually closes the one major outlet that was left for Russian oil exports with, not being sanctioned. But again, I think what introduces complexity in those arguments is that the market has found workarounds before to sort of new curveballs. So it may find a workaround to this as well. And then while you have China and India, officially some refiners are saying that, yeah, we will suspend. You have to bear in mind that there might be reasons they need to officially take a certain stand. I mean, if they are looking at ways to continue importing with a name change, it does originate from Rosneft or Lukoil, but along the way, the name of the supplier changes somehow magically, either within Russia or outside Russia. If they are looking to do that, and I suspect they are, they're not going to say that openly, right? So, which is why all of this picture puts the market in a much more wait and see mode, I would think, than the previous rounds of sanctions.
Bill, just picking up on that from a gas point of view, I mean, one of the things you hear all the time when you speak to those asked to comply with the G7 sanctions that are not supported by the UN or any other institution, that when Europe stops importing LNG from Russia and certain parts of Europe stops importing diesel from Russia, come knock on our door then. I mean, where do you see the gas story, or what does it tell us about some of these issues related to the oil sanctions that are now being faced upon India and China?
So the gas that's still being imported into the EU or Europe, broader Europe, is either the 20 BCM of LNG from mainly from Novatek, and the other one is there's still some pipeline supply coming in through Turkey into Southeast Europe. I think that you can see that the Europeans have upped their game, and they want to try and end these supplies sooner rather than later after Trump's comments. But the reality is that it's not. I mean, the vast bulk of Russian gas supply to Europe is gone. This is the tail end of the story, and I don't think you should underestimate the bulk of Europeans' desire to not have any further relationship of an energy kind with Russia. That's the case. Quite how this staged ending of that supply happens is difficult to figure out because there are difficult legal contractual arrangements that need to be made. It's not going to be particularly easy to declare force majeure And there's an awful lot of litigation between Gazprom and European buyers already underway. So it's not a happy story. That said, there is a huge wave of new LNG coming, partly from Qatar, mostly from the US, before the end of the decade. And that means that if you buy the glut story on oil, we are heading into a cyclical downturn of oversupply in any case.
What about this story that came out here? I mean, it's been around for a while, but it hit the headlines here in ADIPEC this week, which is the Qatar and ExxonMobil sort of warning Europe that if they don't change this regulatory oversight on some of the ESG requirements, etc., the granular details, I'm not really au fait on, but ultimately saying that they would cut off LNG supply to Europe. That would sort of change the dynamics of Europe's stomping the ground on Russia a little bit. Is this serious, or is this just a bit of noise?
I'm not so sure. I agree. I think there is an argument that Europe likes to overregulate, and that's whether it's a question of methane regulation or ESG or whatever it happens to be. There is that argument, and we've heard that point made. But the reality is there's not a great deal of Qatari LNG coming into Europe anymore. Most of it is coming from the US. So it's more important to get alignment between US regulation and European regulation. I personally think that the European market's going to be a rich seam of buying for US LNG for some time to come. So I don't think it's a relationship that's going to be that easy to overturn. But it is critical. Basically, Europe has replaced the reliance on Russian pipeline gas with a reliance on US LNG.
Nice and expensive US LNG. Sarah, other news that could be playing a role in this tug of war in the oil markets and is had yet to really show its teeth, I would say, but nonetheless, again, it's kind of in the Trumpian noise of locating an armada of U.S. Navy vessels near Venezuela, which holds the world's largest crude oil reserves, and now threatening some kind of assault on Nigeria, which holds Africa's largest oil, I think, maybe behind Libya, but certainly significant oil producer in Africa. Again, we're not seeing this muster too much excitement in the oil market. Are these serious, or are these just like Canadian sanctions? I hate you today, I love you tomorrow. I mean, this is potentially serious. He is putting literally naval vessels in place. They aren't pretend.
So, Sean, if I want to just kind of put everything we discussed into a perspective,
yes,
President Trump administration,
Washington perspective.
Washington bubble perspective. Yeah. It's very important to consider that President Trump administration, and particularly Secretary Chris Wright, the Energy Secretary, they have constantly talking about affordability and availability.
And they've been doing
energy.
It here in Abu Dhabi this week as well.
And in fact, they did. So yesterday, that if those that they follow ADIPEC, when the opening remark of the opening ceremony, we had His Excellency Dr. Sultan speaking, and then after that, Secretary Burgum, U.S. Secretary, Interior Secretary, which is also head of the National Council for Energy Dominance at the White House. And what he said is that the energy demand is only going to go, I quote him, up, and up. And it's all about energy addition. So it might be.
And he also said the transition is dead. I think that was another one of his quotes.
Dead, and we have the energy addition. So the thing is
and his job title was quite interesting. What was it? The Energy Dominance Council or something like that?
So if you allow me, first of all, because when we say energy dominance, people, they think that the US wants to dominate the rest of the world. But when they talk about energy dominance, it's pretty much same thing that, for instance, Saudi Arabia described it, to monetize every resources of energy that we can in the United States without incentivizing any of them, any sources of energy, to create abundant, affordable sources of energy. And all these discussions that the US is going to export, let's say, LNG to Europe, and Europe is going to completely reduce its dependency on Russia. If we look at the way AI and data centers, now we're talking in West Virginia, that even a small restaurant cannot get permission to open because of the lack of electricity. So when we are looking at this exponential increase of energy demand in the next 5-6 years, not even a decade, the question is that would the United States, if we had the infrastructure inside our country to produce electricity from every molecule of gas that we're producing, would we still export it to Russia, to Europe? So what I think is that, yes, these policies, there might be Washington wants to, let's say, President Trump's way of trying to solve some of the conflict around the world. Let's say in this case, Russia-Ukraine conflict, but all of this seems that they're very
short-term. What about
Venezuela?
Venezuela
Again at the same, but if
that's
you look
where
at
the naval vessels are. They're not in the Baltic Sea. They're in Venezuela, which has the potential of 3 million barrels of oil a day.
And even Venezuelan oil export, if you look at it today, is
the last time Bill and I had a cup of tea in Caracas was when Venezuela was producing 3 million barrels of oil a day.
Yeah, that's
so the thing is that I'm going back to the beginning that Vandana was talking about all these geopolitical risks and that how the prices of oil doesn't move, is that I think that when we look at, when we step a little outside of the short term, the long term, the medium long term looks that the demand is so high that we need all sources of energy from all different countries. So again, like putting sanctions and all these geopolitical factor from short term to long term or medium term, it changes the whole dynamic. And I have no answer for you when it comes to the military, because that's a question for President Trump.
No, I know, and it is, I think, a key question, because ultimately it's all like a lot of the Trump universe, the Trump administration on trade and tariffs. It's also on the energy side. They come and we hear all of this. We need and at the same time, then we're saying sanctions on Russia, but not on Iran. Invade Venezuela, but not. I mean, any one of these pennies that drop could be quite consequential if indeed one takes them at face value, and I think one has to an extent, take them at face value until they're not. Let's go to the survey question and try and get a bit of a read on the room's view on what will win the battle for the direction of oil price through the rest of Q4, which we've been talking about some of these ideas. The supply surplus bear, the tight idle capacity bull. What exactly is the idle capacity now available in the market? Does it even cover the sanctioned Russian oil companies? Is it even that big? Or if it's not, weak OECD demand bear, that we're seeing a U.S. economy that seems to be increasingly on a weaker sort of slide, or China stockpiling bull. Which of these is going to win the tug of war in the short term and through the rest of the Q4? Which of these narratives dictate and will surface to be more determining than the other? Vandana, I wanted you didn't really grab it on my last time around, but let's just start, which is the idle capacity question, which I think isn't getting the kind of attention. We surfed through the post-COVID years, and it was the headline every day. There is 5-6 million barrels of idle capacity because the cuts are so large and all of this sort of stuff. And it was seen as a fairly determining factor in the market. And over the years has been at different times. What does it represent now? I mean, it would say to me, looking at it all things included, the market is not really accounting for the fact that we have a pretty narrow idle capacity window at the moment.
It's classic short-termism of the oil market, Sean. Normally, people start counting the barrels of that are still as idle capacity available only when the market becomes tight. And as things stand now, nobody is talking of tight market. Well, first of all, nobody is looking beyond 2026, and that is the short-termism of the oil market, right? Which is why, again, we have so many industry leaders and ministers at ADIPEC yesterday reminding people that, okay, even if we have in the short to medium term an oversupplied market, let's think beyond and look beyond 2026. So I think that's what is happening. There's a lot of the marketplace is just unwilling to look beyond, let's call it Q1, Q2, first half of next year, our 2026 oversupply situation to want to pay attention to. Obviously, the buffer has diminished as OPEC Plus brings back the curbs, or rather unwinds the curbs. And the bigger danger out there, Sean, is that there isn't much investment happening to grow that capacity other than less than a handful of nations, right? So maybe Saudi Arabia has some, UAE has some, perhaps Iraq has some. In the US, we know that if prices remain subdued, 26 and beyond that, we are not going to see much of shale growth, possibly a plateau. We may even have seen peak shale for all we know. So, and that's why we have these cycles in the marketplace, just complacence, so that there's lots of supply leading to less investment, more demand from low oil prices, leading to not enough supply and higher prices. And I could go on and on, but I think we all know what
before you go on and on, can you tell me how you voted in that survey question?
Yeah, I voted on the first one. I think I'm not very bearish, Sean, but I do feel it's the surplus supply expectations, and to be fair, I do expect there will be an excess through this quarter and the next quarter. I think that's the main prevailing force, and once we have the risk premium issue settled, I think the path of least resistance is probably going to be a little bit downward for crude.
Bill, your last comment, I wanted to get your thoughts on the sort of narrative we've been discussing here, which is kind of convergence in the gas story, which is the LNG supply that's coming from the US, and that it's going to be the new savior of Europe, or is already, and so forth. But ultimately, how does that square with the other point, which has just been mentioned, that maybe we've seen the peak of shale oil, and with that, of course, associated gas? How does this two things coexist, that US could continue to be a major gas and LNG supplier to Europe when shale may be peaking and declining?
I think it's further to Sarah's point about demand for energy actually inside the US, and that's something that is being talked about more and more. I find is that with the AI boom, it's uncertain and everything, but there is going to be more demand for gas-fired power in the US. Those LNG projects that haven't achieved FID yet, I'd be doubtful if they ever will. But even with the projects that are FID'd and under construction, there's an awful lot of LNG coming. And that is going to have an impact on prices. We would expect to see prices down to the sort of $6 to $8 range. For LNG, currently at about $11, and that will, all other things equal.
Which market? Six into Asia, into Europe?
Yeah, well, I mean, the global market for LNG is increasingly converging, so it's the same thing. And then you'll start to see, some South Asian demand increasing. You might see China taking more LNG, and Southeast Asia would take more LNG as well. I'm not so sure about the OECD. The OECD countries, everything kind of hinges on how you view this AI thing, and whether you believe that that's a thing, or whether it's more of a bubble. It kind of reminds me of the late 90s and the dot-com boom, which kind of fizzled a little bit. It didn't really turn out to be the energy demand boost that some people had thought about. So my view is that, the big forces right now in oil and gas markets is probably macro. The uncertainties around trade, tariffs, the huge debt issue the public debt issue which all developed countries are currently dealing with. There's a lot of risk in there.
And China.
And the other thing is geopolitics is really, really uncertain at the moment. You've got the US threatening Nigeria, Venezuela, Iran, other countries that are major oil producers within OPEC. That's unusual. We've had 2 attacks on Qatar in the last year, one of the big sources of LNG, obviously. All of this is not very good for long-term market demand, I think. That's my view, and so I think, yeah, I verge on the bearish side.
Sarah, I wanted to get your thought. Well, what are the survey results here? We're looking at tight idle capacity versus weak OEC demand. But any of your takeaways from ADIPEC, just converging some of the points that were mentioned there, that the idea that the AI economy and the AI demand in the US will keep a lot of energy at home. But it seems to me that the big players are maybe betting on putting the AI universe in the Gulf. Your thoughts as to what you took away from ADIPEC, and just speaking to that point of that the AI future may not be based in America, i.e. the AI data farms and all the associated energy demand.
That's very good point, Sean. And also Secretary Bergen yesterday talked about this point, this issue. So I would say that now, at least again, from Washington perspective, from my perspective, being in Washington, we are in AI madness. So U.S. administration and U.S. government sees themselves.
No pun intended.
It's not the gold rush. They seem them. It seems they feel that and they see a very critical AI race, particularly with China. So the race for expanding the AI, it's real. Most of even if you look at who are the people standing behind U.S. president, it's not anymore Exxon or Chevron, is all the tech companies. So we have projects like Stargate, $500 billion of AI in Texas, but also UAE and US are working together to build a huge AI facility, let's say in Abu Dhabi, maybe in Saudi Arabia. So why in Gulf? Because the cost of energy is very low. And, if you want to win this race, that I think, to me, if I feel that I don't know something, I'm missing something, because why we need that much of AI? But again, Secretary Bergen yesterday said that, knowledge is not power, and not just knowledge is power, but now power is knowledge. So they are looking for.
And he also said, sorry to interrupt, because there was another quote that stuck in my head since yesterday. He said, we now can manufacture knowledge.
Exactly.
Like knowledge can be manufactured, because once you can create energy, as in the electricity to generate AI, you can manufacture knowledge. You don't need this.
Exactly. Which I mean, it is scary. And maybe we have to start thinking about it. But what I would say, yes, definitely is not just going to be a US firms are going to create hubs in areas that cost of energy is very low, which again, Gulf countries, particularly, let's say UAE, Saudi Arabia, that they have that infrastructure, a lot of sun, and also fossil fuel to create that low-cost energy is going to be in high demand. So we're going to see a lot of, at least during President Trump administration, a lot of movement of companies, flow of investment, and race for expanding the AI and data centers. So I would say, and the other thing I want to mention about when it comes to oil prices, and this was actually, we discussed it yesterday. I had the privilege of being part of the OPEC leadership roundtable and talking to a lot of traders, is that we should give credit to, when it comes to oil and compared to other commodities that had the least volatility this year, and that is important because for investors, they need certainty and they don't like the volatility. And in compared to other commodities, we could say that oil was one of the ones that had the least, and we should give that credit really to OPEC, and OPEC Plus, because we talked a lot about how much they're bringing into the market, why they are not bringing, paused for the first Q, but they have constantly mentioned, I think this is OPEC's consistent mantra, that, we are monitoring the market. We are going to decide our decisions market-based. We can always reverse our decisions. And I would say we have to give this credit for this lower volatility when it comes to oil, at least in this current year, with regard to all those geopolitical factors that was mentioned, and the Klotz narrative and all those narratives in the market.
Well, it certainly is a good place to wrap up, and maybe also a reason why the Gulf might be the attractive center for AI and data centers, because of the lack of volatility and the predictability that you're seeing in the US now. You never know what's going to change. If you're going to bet that kind of money, put it in a place that's a bit more predictable. And that by, and of course, and most significantly, I would say, and knowing from my own country in Ireland, try to get a license to build a data farm in Ireland. It takes about 5 years and about 75 different hurdles. You can get it signed off here pretty quickly, which I think is another attractive element. Anyway, that's another day's work. Meanwhile, oil price is stuck at its very happy place at $65 on Brent, give or take 50 cents. More than happy to go, little Goldilocks, sleepy there. Bill Farm Price, great to see you, mate. Sarah Vashkuri, hopefully I'll see you around the village here at Adipec. And Vandana Hari, as always, thank you so much for your insights today. All the best. We'll catch up with you all soon again. Greetings from Adipec.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.